Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's February 11, 2021, and today we are talking with George Noack, Senior Curator for South and Southeast Asia at the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, Germany. Hello, George.
Hello, Luke. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to speak here.
George's PhD thesis and resultant book, Local Traditions, Global Modernities, focused on dress and adornment in urban Burmese society during the first decade of the 21st century. It also tackled the colonial history of Myanmar dress and its use in visual representations. As an avid longi wearer, I can really recommend this book. But George's recent work has shifted from the urban to the rural, looking at Kayah State in eastern Myanmar and the material culture there. So, George, could you please introduce your latest project and how it came about?
So, being a museum curator here at the Linden Museum since 2012, in 2013 we received a major collection of various objects of material culture from the minorities of various parts of Myanmar. And a substantial collection actually came from what is now referred to as Kayah State in the official terminology. And there were some notes coming with that, the names of villages, names of people, and I became very interested in researching the origins and the history of these objects. Where did they come from? They were all pre-owned. They were not newly made textiles, clothing, jewelry, but they had all belonged to people. And for some, even the names were written down of the people to whom they had belonged. The beginning of the project was actually going there and trying to find out if those people were still there and if anybody could tell me more about the stories behind these objects. Because they had been collected in the 1960s, a very difficult and turbulent time in that part of Myanmar when there was a very intense war going on. So I imagine that many of these objects would have been sold to the collectors just out of the need of getting money in order to survive in that situation. Maybe people who were trying to escape needed money to buy food, needed money to get away somewhere where it was safer for them. So I wanted to learn more about those stories. But that was a bit difficult because many of the spellings, the transcriptions of the names of villages, of places, of people were rather erratic. And it was, in many cases, it was not even possible to identify which village was meant by that. And the names were rather common names. So many of the villages there are Christian villages. So you would have like 50 women called Maria. And that makes it a bit difficult to trace the stories of those objects. But in the process, I got to know people doing cultural work there, mainly the literacy and culture committees of the various groups that live in Kayah State. And I got to know them as very active and very, very dedicated people doing great work. And so I came to think about, as a museum, what can we do together with them? How can we support their work? In the museum world, you may know that for anthropology museums, there's a big debate going on about our colonial pasts and about what we should do with these collections coming from colonial contexts, if we should go and give them all back, or what else is our responsibility, what could be our tasks in the future. And we are currently having a series of so-called labs or laboratories, experimental projects where we're trying to redefine ourselves as an anthropology museum. And my idea was to develop or experiment with new strategies, what we can actually give back to people, to communities where objects came from. So I asked that openly, and well, we said the opinion was that there were still plenty of those objects around, and they already had started to build up small collections. So there was no very strong need for that. But they were much more interested in sharing other forms of knowledge, in strategies of how to do cultural work, how to build exhibitions with those objects, how to educate people, tell stories with objects, and so on and so forth. Things that are the bread and butter of museum work, so to say. So we thought about, okay, there's perhaps possibilities to give back in different ways, not just sending objects back, but also helping and assisting those groups and their cultural work by offering expertise, by offering advice, and by doing projects together that would benefit both sides. In the project, I had to focus myself on two communities, two committees, literature and culture committees, literacy and culture committees. The translations are different. In Burmese, it's always Sabi and Jimu committee. And those were the Kayan Literature and Culture Central Committee and the Kayon Literature and Culture Central Committee. And both of them had different ideas what they would be interested in doing together with the museum. And we started implementing a few of those projects together. For the Kayon, we organized a joint workshop taking place in a place called Chow Mein, 6 Mile, which is between Loiko and Dimoso. And every year on the 15th of April, the Kayon are holding a Kayon National Day celebration. And it takes place in different villages, Kayon villages all throughout the region. And this includes, of course, speeches of politicians, leaders, and all that, but also dances and other activities. And every third year, it also includes a Kayon youth meeting. And that was the case when we did the workshop in 2019. It was around about 450 Kayon young people coming from villages all throughout the region, aged between, say, 15 and 20, 25. The idea that the Kayon Literature and Culture Committee had was that we could organize a workshop inviting senior experts, elders from the villages to pass on knowledge about traditional techniques of making things, of weaving, of making baskets, of making adornment, jewelry, all kinds of things that were part of traditional material culture, but are now in the process of disappearing quite fast. So we did that. We invited 20 elderly people, elders from the villages who were experts in various of those crafts and skills. And for 5 days, while the youth meeting was taking place, they would be working there, and young people would be standing around, would be trying it themselves, how to do it, would be shown, demonstrated, try this, try that. And there was a big interest there. And on top of this, we collected all the things that were made during those 5 days. We photographed and filmed the process of making, the various steps involved, cut this together as short videos, but also the results were collected by the Kayon Literature and Culture Committee. And they then decided on a small selection of objects that were to travel to Germany to be displayed in the Linden Museum. And then in a second step, a delegation from the Kayon Literature and Culture Committee came to Stuttgart, and together we developed an exhibition from objects that were already in our collection, the older objects, and the newly made ones that were made during that workshop. And we had a series of workshops with them, including conservation, how to preserve objects, even under simple conditions, without having an air condition or anything, just so that they would last longer. Then how to set up different kinds of displays to make them more impressive for visitors to look at them. We had discussions about language, about how to write texts explaining the objects in a simple and easily understandable language, but also in just language, gender, and these issues were discussed in a different workshop. We had a workshop with our educators at the museum sharing how they would develop programs for various age groups to tell stories about the objects and help people enjoy the experience of seeing them and learning about them. So, and in the entire process, an exhibition was created that is now still on display in Stuttgart, but we've also made like an online version of that, which can be accessed from our website. And the texts are all written by the visitors, the partners from the Culture, Literature and Culture Committee. The display, how things should be displayed, what should be together, what should be next to each other, it was all decided by them. For the Kayan Literature and Culture Central Committee, the process was a bit different. They decided that they would rather focus on traveling to villages where skilled craftsmen were, filming the process there and commissioning things for their own collection, but also supporting those craftsmen and craftswomen by having objects made, a number of objects made that were paid for by the Linden Museum and then were to be displayed in an exhibition here. So it was more on video documentation and doing interviews and all that extensively with people in the villages. And that happened as well. And their delegation from the Kayan Literature and Culture Center Committee traveled to Stuttgart together with the Kyo delegation. We had 4 people, 4 guests here, 4 partners here. And together we did all these workshops and developed the exhibition. And for them, it was, at least that was the feedback I got, it was a great experience in that they got many new perspectives on how things could possibly be done, got many new ideas on that they could also use and implement for their own works. They do traveling exhibitions in both the National Day celebrations, the Chaos Day celebration, what is it called? An ethnic festival that is taking place once a year in Yangon. And in other places. So many of the things they saw here gave them ideas of what could be done and how that could possibly also be used there. But it had also a different effect. Both committees had tried to contact and work with the Kayar State Cultural Museum in Loiko, which is run by the state, because they were not so happy about the displays there. Very stereotypically, very traditional, with dummies, with dolls, and oversimplifying. And sometimes my impression was some of the texts were even bluntly racist. So they were rather unhappy about that and had tried to voice their concerns and have it changed, but had not been heard. And now, having received some kind of training here, having more expertise, more knowledge about that, they found new ways of addressing their concerns. And what I heard is that in the last months, at least before the coup now, they were actually heard and changes started to be made also in that museum there. So the idea behind the project was not only to give them an opportunity to present their own culture here in Stuttgart in a way they would want it, or the public in Germany, to see it. So it was all their decisions, their texts, but also to give them as much knowledge and expertise and skills, or share whatever we could with them that might be useful both for their own cultural work, but also for their chances of being heard and having a stronger voice vis-a-vis the government and cultural institutions of the state in Myanmar. And that worked quite well, I think. Unfortunately, now we don't know how to continue that. We're constantly in touch via all types of media. I know that both groups are setting up buildings that are to serve as offices for the cultural committees, for their classes, teachers' trainings, but it will also feature display rooms, like a mini museum in the building. And they've already asked us for advice and for helping them. We were planning to travel there also with staff from our museum, conservators possibly, to advise on the implementation of a few things that might be helpful. And hoping to establish something of a long-term partnership there. But under the current condition, it's quite uncertain how this can be continued and if they can continue with their work as they did until January this year.
Wow, George, that's a really laudable initiative. For people who maybe haven't been to Kayah State, or even for people who have been to Kayah State, you've mentioned a few names of different kinds of people. You've mentioned Kayah people, Kayor people, Kayan people. So what is the deal with all these names? How are people identified within their own groups and by the Myanmar state in 2021 or historically?
Well, there are different perspectives on that. The government, the lists of 8 national races and the 135 list that is also quite controversial. And in this list, you would find 9 subgroups under the category Kayah. And the government there lists the Kayah, Ziyen, Padang, Geko, Geba, Bre, Manu, Yindele, and Yinbon. Now, this list locally is very controversial because most of these names would be called exonyms. So they're names that Shan people or Bama people would be calling those groups. But those groups have different names for themselves, or the people belonging to those groups have different names for their own group. And on top of this, some of the categories are also controversial in that the government has split them up into several different groups, whereas local cultural and political organizations, such as the Kayan Literature and Culture Committee and the Kayan National Convention that meets every 3rd year, has developed their own systematics and terminology for that. For instance, the groups are listed as Zayen, Padang, Geko, and Yimbo in the government list are all considered to be subgroups of Kayan. So the Kayan Literature and Culture Committee and the Kayan National Convention includes people belonging to those 4 groups. And they have their own names for that. For instance, the people whom the government list refers to as Zayen would refer to themselves as Kayan Lata, whereas the people listed as Padang in the government list, it's a Shan name, would refer to themselves as Kayan Kakao. Geko would be Kayan Gadol. And Yimbo, here it's a bit more controversial because there's 2 subgroups and the division also across along religious lines within that group. But most would consider them or would call them Kayan Kangan rather than Yimbo. The Bre is actually a derogative term meaning dirty, or something like that at least. We prefer to call themselves Kayon. And for Geba, it's another term that is problematic in that the same people are also referred to as Geyimpu or White Karen, and as such appear under the Karen supercategory again as a second group. So there's a lot of issues with those lists of names there. The group here listed as Manu Manon is referring to themselves, if I remember it correctly, as Koyo. And you will notice that there are many similarities between the names. You have Kaya, you have Kayan, you have Koyo, you have Koyo. This is probably due to the fact that they speak different but closely related languages, those groups. And the term Kaya, the different variants of that mean people in those languages. So it's a term that occurs in different spellings and slightly different pronunciations in all those groups. And there are quite a number of shared cultural issues, cultural traditions, when it comes to material culture, how things are made. Also, say, musical instruments like the panpipes or these bamboo tube zithers that are shared by, or the frog drums that are shared by most of those groups. Yet they have separate languages and also separate interpretations of these objects. For instance, we have quite a number of panpipes in our collection. And so I learned that in most Kayan groups, the panpipes would be exclusively used in mourning ceremonies. So when somebody has died and there was a funeral, people would have a wake for a whole night, and a lot of singing and mourning would be going on, and the panpipes would be played then. Whereas in a Kayar context, the number of pipes in the panpipe is different. And also the context where they would be played and the tunes that would be played are very different. They would be played for harvest festivals, for different kinds of auspicious opportunities as well. So not at all connected to mourning or to sadness. And the connotation thus being sadness in the Kayan case is happiness and celebration in the Kayar case. So you have different cultural traditions. The languages are also so different from each other that people wouldn't be understanding each other. There is a shared writing system between the many of the groups that was devised by Italian missionaries. So they're using the Latin alphabet with added diacritics, dots and accents and so on to indicate different vowel qualities and different tones. But there are also writing systems based on the Burmese, on the Myanmar alphabet, and there is a separate Kayar alphabet that was developed by people in the Kayar resistance in the 1960s and has been promoted as the means to write the Kayar language and also a few other languages in those areas controlled by the KNPP, one of the main political and armed groups in that region. So in their educational institutions, in the refugee camps on the Thai side of the border, people would be learning that to write their language in that alphabet. So there are many differences also when it comes to clothing and adornment, for instance, textiles to jewelry. Each of the group has very different traditions, different colors, different patterns, and all that they're very proud of.
So, given the collaborative nature of this project and this diversity, maybe we could talk about some of the objects that you all chose to highlight in the exhibition and how that was done. So, for example, if you put the pan flute, what do you say about the pan flute, given the contrasting kinds of cultural resonances, for example? And maybe you could mention some of your favorite items and what it was like going back. Did you ever find Maria number 33 that you needed?
Unfortunately, no. I didn't actually find any of those people to whom the objects had originally belonged to, though there was an interesting story in that one of the delegates who came to Stuttgart to participate in the project remembered hearing from her grandfather that collector was coming there in the 1960s, and he met him and he asked for his friends, relatives, networks throughout the region to bring things for that collector. So we found that connection there, but we couldn't pursue it any further because the grandfather was no longer alive, and also those people we could ask wouldn't remember whom the object actually came from. Well, talking about the individual objects, it was a negotiation process, the writing of the texts, because they drafted, our partners drafted those texts. They did so together. For instance, talking about the panpipes or the musical instruments in general, both delegations, the Kayan and the Kyo delegation, drafted the texts together and highlighted how those objects had different connotations and different uses in the different communities. But also we went through them again together to point out that some statements might be a bit too broad, too much saying all people do it like this, and rather than mentioning that there's also differences within the communities, that it's common for people to do so, but some people also do it differently. And these things are there, and there's a tendency to generalize and say it's the Kyo people do it like that, and the Kayan people do it like that. And it makes sense to look into those statements also, and we discussed those statements with our partners if it made sense to differentiate a bit more, or use a more relativating terminology, saying it's common for many people in that group to do so, but rather than saying that they do it like that. Talking about favorite objects, being interested in music and singing traditions and sung poetry of that regions, we've documented some of that as well. I was particularly interested in the musical instruments and how they're used, how they're played. And we have a nice collection here in Stuttgart now, both of old instruments, panpipes, and other objects coming, but also newly made ones. So we got a newly made bamboo zither. We got a newly made jaw harp that comes from one of those groups. And we had to add a picture of a frog drum, because there's no frog drum in Stuttgart, and those instruments are so precious and so rare in the region now that it would not have at all be possible to take one of those to abroad. It's such an important heritage for the community, and they belong there and they shouldn't be anywhere else. So we had a picture of that one as well. And the many different connotations also for the zither that can be used to express feelings, all kinds of feelings. They're played by both men and women, and they can be played, for instance, among the Kyo to impress a girl that you're in love with by sitting somewhere next to her house and playing for her and composing words to sing about a possible common future and things like that. But they can also be used they are also played when you're angry about somebody and sing songs to mock them, to make fun of them and make jokes about them. And they can be used to we made recordings, beautiful recordings of an elderly lady playing a zither and singing songs to express her sadness about being lonely, her husband having passed away, all her 16 children having gone somewhere else to work, and she being the only one left in the village. So you can use this, it's the instrument to express your feelings in many of those communities. And the feelings can be from love and happiness to sadness, from anger to making fun of somebody. A very beautiful and very interesting object for me is what could be called a lunchbox. It's made from bamboo fiber, very artfully crafted, a little box with a lid, and then covered with tree resin, a black tree resin that comes from trees growing locally in the hills of the region. And this is an object I was told that they collected from a Kayan Lata village in the mountains somewhere in Pekon Township. So that's southern Shan State already, but close to the border with Kayah State. and there are only few people who still know how to make them. So they made a documentary about how these were made, because they actually weave patterns into the walls of this, and the shape is quite beautiful already. It's really art. It's not just craft. It's really an art form of making these. And in the old days, young men would practice making those for their families, for their sisters, and so on, to take rice and other things when they were working in the fields, in the mountain fields, so they couldn't get back for lunch. So they would take their lunches with those boxes to have them at noontime in the field somewhere in the shadow of a tree. But the aim of practicing making them was to be able to make very beautiful boxes, because that was necessary in order to court women. You had to be able to make one of those in order to impress and be considered for marriage, so to say. That was kind of the precondition to find a spouse as a young man in those villages and in the northern part of the Kayan lands. A few elderly men still had practiced that and had learned that during their youth, and one of them made two of those boxes, one for the Kayan Literature and Culture Committee and one for us, which is now in the exhibition. And he remembered winning his spouse, his wife, who had passed away by then, by making one of those boxes. So that's a beautiful story behind that as well. Another object that I like quite well is a set of crescent-shaped silver ornaments that Kayol women wear as a necklace here on their chests. I was told that nowadays it's part of a standardized national Kayol costume that they would be wearing for the Kayol National Day, for Kayol State Day, for celebration. There's also a village promoting community-based tourism where many people would still wearing that, so that the tourists can have a look at the traditional dress and attire of people. But in the old days, the first of those would be given to a girl by her suitor, the fellow who wanted to marry her on the occasion of engagement. So a girl who would be wearing one of those would be engaged, but not yet married. The second one would be given to her from her parents, from her mother, on the occasion of her marriage. So a married girl would be wearing two of those. Nowadays, they're often made of any kind of silver-colored metal, aluminium, white tin, you name it. In the old days, they were actually made from silver, and so they were quite costly and quite precious, and that would be something that a mother would then give on one of those to her daughters if she could. The two of them that we have in our exhibition in the museum now, they were collected in the 1960s. We don't know whom they belonged to, but it must have been very difficult for the lady who sold them to the collector back then to part with that, because that would really have been something indicating her social status, but also probably being passed down from her mother, inherited from her mother, even her grandmother perhaps. So that's very important objects, and objects that have a story behind them, which unfortunately we have not been to uncover wholly, but only in a more generalized manner.
Wow, George, that's a really tantalizing introduction to a few of the objects that are now in Stuttgart and online. I'll once again say that the link to the online exhibition is in the description of this podcast. And now I'd like to throw it over to you, George, to give some recommendations to our listeners. Anything else you would like to recommend, maybe regarding Kayah State or Myanmar in general?
Well, if you're more interested in the history and culture of that region and those people I've just talked about, both committees, the Kayan Literature and Culture Committee and also the Kayol Literature and Culture Committee have published history books. They have both published a cultural history of the Kayol people, cultural history of the Kayan people in Burmese. So you need to be able to read Burmese, but those are available also from bookshops in Yangon and other parts of the country now. And they really make a good read in that they begin with the legends, the origin myths of descending from heaven, the creator God, and so on. But then also of a migration south. And the interesting thing about those tales about the migration south, coming somewhere from Central Asia and migrating down along the Danluin River, they kind of merge legends that are handed down in songs and poems from the old generations with things that linguists wrote. So from the colonial period onwards, missionaries and linguists looked at the languages and set up theories about, migrating from the Yangtze Valley, migrating from Mongolia or somewhere else, and then that being the roots of Kayin, Karen, but also Karenni or Kayana people. And those seamlessly merge into these origin legends, and it's very difficult to actually know where one begins and where one ends, and where the other ends. And as you continue reading, the more factual parts come into it. So when we get into the 19th century, we have the local rulers, we have the British arriving, we have anti-colonial resistance, we have resistance against the Karenni states being occupied by the Burmese state, by the newly independent state of Burma. And the stories of experiencing the war and the various movements and actors that stakeholders that took part in it right until the present. So those two books make very interesting readings and are really written from an indigenous perspective. So I can only highly recommend them. If you have a chance to visit the region, I would also highly recommend the cuisines, the food of those groups. The sausages are great. For instance, you have those so-called kaya sausages. They're very different from the sausages that you'd be getting in Yangon, the Chinese sweet sausages, in that they're salty and they're very spicy. And they use what is sometimes referred to as kaya pepper. Here in the West, it's more known as the Sichuan pepper, or in Burmese, it's called mekadi, that has a very distinct flavor, and it's a bit prickly on your tongue, and has a it's very fragrant. Then this comes together with red mountain rice. You can also have various kinds of, for instance, a pound in a mortar, and then add lime juice, add chili and other spices, mekadi most likely, so the kaya pepper. Very spicy but delicious food that you can have with the red rice coming from the mountain fields, dry mountain fields. It's not wet rice. You can, of course, try kaungyi, which is some people compare it to Japanese sake, actually, because the ingredients are quite similar. So it's a fermented rice or fermented sorghum, depending on where it's made. There's also spirits distilled from that, which you can also try. Most of it is really delicious, and I can only highly recommend it. There are a few good restaurants in and around Loikaw. Give it a try.
Oh, those are killer recommendations. I can really testify to the joy of trying all the various local fermented and distilled liquors there. It's really cool. You've got people using sorghum, rice, corn, everything like that, and then submerging feces from insects, detritus from mole burrows into the liquor, and it's really, really cool. So I'm just going to tack on that. I'm going to double that recommendation of yours, George. Yeah, well, we're at the end. So thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musings.
Thank you for the interview. It was a pleasure talking to you.